We always talk about the anxious partner, the one who holds on too tightly, but what happens when they finally let go? That's when the avoidant feels something they never expected: regret. When a relationship dynamic includes an anxious partner and an avoidant partner, there is often a push-pull tension at play. The anxious person seeks closeness, validation, and connection. The avoidant values space, independence, and emotional distance. These two attachment styles often create a cycle. One reaches, the other retreats. And for a while, this dance can continue endlessly, with neither party feeling truly fulfilled, but both feeling emotionally entangled. What often goes unnoticed is the immense power held in what seems like a quiet decision, the moment the anxious partner decides not to chase anymore. This moment rarely arrives with shouting, ultimatums, or fireworks. It arrives in silence, and it's that silence that becomes deafening for the avoidant. For the anxious person, walking away is rarely an impulsive act, it's a process. It comes after countless moments of self-doubt, internal debates, and painful attempts to communicate needs that are either ignored or minimized. It's 1,000 small heartbreaks before the final break. But once that point is reached, something subtle but seismic shifts. When the anxious stops texting first, stops checking in, stops offering emotional warmth without reciprocation, it's not just a behavioral change, it's an energetic one. It communicates something far more powerful than any long emotional monologue ever could. I no longer need to convince you to love me. For the avoidant, this shift is destabilizing. Avoidants often function under the belief that connection will always be there, even if they keep it at arm's length. They're used to being pursued, used to the anxious partner bridging the gap, initiating repair, making excuses, or offering emotional security. It gives them control. So, when that consistent stream of emotional energy suddenly stops, it sends ripples through their internal sense of security, not in the relationship, but in the dynamic they've come to rely on. The absence of pursuit doesn't just feel like quiet, it feels like loss, not necessarily the loss of the person at first, but the loss of a role, the loss of someone who was always willing to wait. This is where the real power shift begins, when the anxious person walks away without begging, pleading, or dramatic closure. It breaks the avoidance illusion that they can always come back to the safety net. And unlike dramatic exits, which can be dismissed as emotional outbursts, this kind of quiet exit lingers. It stays in the mind of the avoidant. It plays in the background during moments of solitude. The silence makes them feel something unfamiliar, uncertainty. Avoidants typically regulate emotions by detaching. They tell themselves that needing someone makes them vulnerable, that closeness will eventually suffocate them, that independence is strength. But now, the independence they longed for feels oddly heavy. They check their phone less out of habit and more out of hope. They revisit conversations and question if they misread signals. They replay the last interaction and wonder if the silence means anger, indifference, or worst of all, moving on. Because in silence, there's no longer a script to follow. There's no longer an emotional rhythm to dance around. And while the anxious partner may have spent the relationship fearing abandonment, the avoidant is now faced with the fear of being forgotten. It's a different kind of anxiety, one they're not used to navigating. And since they struggle with vulnerability, they often can't express it outwardly. They don't know how to say, "I miss you," without also feeling like they're giving up their independence. So, the avoidant waits. They may not reach out, they may post subtly, hoping to be noticed, they may act unbothered, even as their mind races, but something's different. The control they once held through emotional distance has slipped. The silence has taken it. Avoidant attachment isn't about a lack of feeling. It's about discomfort with closeness, a deep-rooted fear that intimacy will lead to entrapment, loss of self, or inevitable pain. So avoidants often keep relationships at a safe emotional distance. They suppress vulnerability, downplay their needs, and often tell themselves they don't need much from anyone. In the process, they protect themselves, but they also end up undervaluing the very connection that makes a relationship meaningful. When they're in a relationship with someone more anxiously attached, they often find themselves overwhelmed. The anxious partner seeks reassurance, closeness, and consistency. To the avoidant, this can feel invasive, needy, or even suffocating, not because the anxious partner is doing something wrong, but because emotional demands trigger discomfort in the avoidant's nervous system. Their coping mechanism is to detach, to intellectualize, to create space, to regain control. As a result, the avoidant may begin to overlook or even resent the qualities that the anxious partner brings to the relationship: emotional attunement, thoughtfulness, efforts to maintain closeness, and the deep desire to connect. Over time, they come to expect these efforts without truly recognizing them. Love becomes something assumed, not appreciated. Devotion becomes background noise, not something to be actively noticed. They don't fully value it, not because they're cold or cruel, but because they're focused on escaping the discomfort that comes with depending on someone. Their internal belief system says, "I have to rely on myself. Too much closeness is dangerous." So even when their partner is giving fully, showing up, staying loyal, investing emotionally, they may not fully register its worth. It becomes easy to downplay the significance of what's being offered when receiving it feels uncomfortable. What complicates this even more is that avoidants often mistake the absence of anxiety for peace. So when the anxious partner stops requesting connection, when they go quiet or pull away, the avoidant may initially feel a sense of relief. Finally, space, they think. Finally, no pressure, but they don't realize that this space isn't freedom, it's emotional absence. It's the beginning of an emotional void they're not immediately aware of. It's only later, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, when the loss begins to register, when the texts stop coming, when the warm check-ins disappear, when the small acts of affection no longer arrive without asking. That's when the avoidant starts to feel an unfamiliar sensation creeping in. They miss the person, but more accurately, they miss the presence, the emotional reliability, the care, the availability, things they never fully acknowledged while they had them. It's a strange kind of grief because it's not rooted in what they had. It's rooted in what they now realize they overlooked. Avoidants often experience regret in hindsight. Their minds circle back to the comfort they never admitted they needed, the acceptance they never openly appreciated, and the emotional warmth they never allowed themselves to fully receive. But because they didn't value it openly when it was there, they don't know how to grieve it properly now that it's gone. This creates a complex emotional contradiction. They miss someone they convinced themselves they didn't need. They long for a connection they downplayed. They feel the absence of something they failed to nurture. And because avoidants often struggle with processing emotion, this realization doesn't lead them to easily reach out or repair. It leads them inward, into quiet discomfort, into wondering how they can miss something they spent so long pushing away. So the avoidant sits with this growing awareness that they may not have lost the anxious partner because of incompatibility, but because they didn't recognize their value until that value was no longer being freely offered. The texts filled with care, the consistent emotional presence, the quiet ways the anxious partner made them feel seen, even when they refused to look closely. All the things they now long for were things they once met with resistance, or worse, indifference. And the loss begins to grow not because the anxious partner left loudly, but because they left when they stopped giving what was never truly received. Avoidantly attached individuals often build their identity around the idea of self-sufficiency. From an early age, they may have learned, through inconsistent caregiving, emotional invalidation, or early betrayal, that needing others is risky, depending on someone felt dangerous, so they developed a strategy: stay independent. Don't get too close, don't rely too much, keep your distance and you won't get hurt. At first glance, this seems empowering. Independence is often praised in our culture. It looks like strength, confidence, and emotional control. The avoidant tells themselves they're doing fine. They don't need constant communication. They don't need regular affection. They're proud of how little they ask from others. But the version of independence they've built is often a protective shell, one designed not for thriving, but for surviving. When they enter a relationship, this mindset doesn't disappear. They might enjoy the early connection, but as soon as things start to feel serious or emotionally vulnerable, their nervous system tightens. They start to feel the pressure of someone else's emotional needs, and instead of leaning in, they begin to pull away. They look for reasons to detach. They downplay their own feelings. They fantasize about freedom, not because they don't care, but because emotional closeness feels like a loss of control. So they often begin to sabotage the relationship in small, almost imperceptible ways. They respond less. They become emotionally unavailable. They criticize, withdraw, or disappear into work, hobbies, or solitude. And while the partner feels the loss and begins to panic, the avoidant often feels relief. Space returns, control returns. They interpret this as peace, at least temporarily, but when the partner finally lets go, when the connection they pushed away actually disappears, the avoidant is left with what they thought they wanted: total independence. No emotional demands, no one texting them expecting an answer, no one waiting for them at home, no one asking them to open up or explain how they feel. It's clean, it's quiet, and it's empty. This is when the truth starts to surface. Because independence, while important, was never meant to be a substitute for intimacy, the avoidant may have achieved emotional autonomy, but it didn't come with warmth, connection, or shared meaning. It came with isolation, and the very freedom they worked so hard to protect starts to feel less like strength and more like disconnection. They begin to notice the small things that are missing, the texts that used to brighten their day, the comfort of knowing someone was emotionally invested, the grounding presence of a person who truly cared. These were things they once viewed as pressure. Now they feel like loss, because true independence isn't about being alone. It's about being free to love without fear. But for the avoidant, their version of independence required shutting down emotion. It required keeping people out, so when they're finally alone, the silence is louder than they anticipated. They realize no one is checking in, no one is waiting for them to open up. There's nothing left to resist, but there's also nothing left to hold. They scroll through their phone, but there's no message from the one they once distanced themselves from. They lie awake at night, and the space in their bed, once a symbol of autonomy, now feels like absence. The things they took for granted, the daily conversations, the care, the emotional availability, begin to echo in their mind as things they can no longer access. They thought love was a burden, that needing someone meant weakness, that emotional independence meant never having to feel vulnerable, but now they're left with a form of solitude that doesn't feel empowering. It feels dull. It lacks the depth that connection brought. The life they imagined would feel free and light now feels unanchored, because independence without someone to share life with isn't fulfillment. It's just functioning. It's motion without meaning. It's self-sufficiency without intimacy. It's space but no gravity. For many avoidantly attached individuals, the idea of being better off alone isn't just a preference, it's a protective belief. It forms slowly, often rooted in early experiences that taught them relationships are unpredictable, suffocating, or unsafe. So, they romanticize independence. They convince themselves that solitude means freedom, and freedom means peace. It becomes a fantasy where they are in full control, answering to no one, never burdened by anyone else's needs, and untouched by emotional chaos. In this fantasy, relationships are distractions, closeness is a threat, emotional reliance is weakness. The avoidant builds a mental picture of a life where they're fully self-sufficient, thriving in their own space, pursuing their goals, and never having to explain themselves or be vulnerable. Love is idealized from a distance, something they think they'll want someday, when it's safe, when they're ready, when it doesn't feel so overwhelming. Until then, they repeat the same internal mantra, "I'm fine on my own," and for a while it works. They function well in solitude. They might even feel relieved after a breakup or a period of distance. They finally have the space they craved. The pressure is gone. Their nervous system calms without the emotional expectations of a partner. They dive into work, hobbies, routines. They tell themselves this is how it's meant to be. Complicated, peaceful, and quiet. But the fantasy isn't built on truth. It's built on fear avoidance. And slowly, without them realizing, the cracks begin to form. Not immediately, not with dramatic emotion, but in the still moments, in the quiet evenings when there's no one to share a thought with, in the little wins they experience but have no one to celebrate with, in the silence that once felt so comforting but now begins to echo. They start to feel the weight of absence, not necessarily of the person, but of connection itself. The morning texts that used to feel like obligations are gone. The conversations that once felt like pressure are now missed. The emotional intimacy they kept at arm's length starts to seem like something they want back, not because they've suddenly changed, but because the illusion they were better off without it is starting to erode. They scroll through social media and see glimpses of the connection they used to have. Couples laughing together, quiet moments of affection, someone reaching for someone else's hand. It hits them not with jealousy, but with realization that in choosing the fantasy of freedom, they may have walked away from something real, something messy, yes, but also grounding. The avoidant starts remembering the emotional security they never acknowledged while it was present. The way their partner knew how to calm them down without asking. The way their presence created a sense of home. At the time, they dismissed it. Now, it resurfaces in their mind as comfort they can no longer access. The fantasy that solitude was superior begins to falter under the reality that it's also lonely, but they don't rush to repair. Avoidants rarely do. They stay frozen in ambivalence, torn between the belief they need to protect themselves and the growing ache of disconnection. They remember how they felt in the relationship, overwhelmed, closed off, distant, and yet that discomfort starts to seem less painful than the current void they live in. This is where the internal conflict begins to peak. The protective story they've told themselves for years, love isn't worth the cost, starts to feel hollow, not because they've suddenly decided they want love, but because they realize that their version of alone is not the sanctuary they imagined. It's not filled with creativity and peace, it's filled with emotional static, a dull ache, a sense of something missing they can't quite name. The idea that being alone was the safe, empowered choice now feels more like a compromise they didn't fully understand when they made it. For avoidant individuals, emotional distance is a form of protection. Throughout a relationship, they may have held back vulnerability, avoided deep conversations, or even minimized their partner's needs, not out of cruelty, but because closeness felt unsafe. They maintained control by staying emotionally one step removed, telling themselves they were just not the emotional type, or that they were guarding their peace, but the truth is, they were guarding themselves from being hurt. So when the partner, often the more anxious or emotionally expressive one, finally pulls away, something begins to shift. At first, the avoidant may feel relief. The pressure is off. The emotional intensity has faded. There's space again, but then, slowly and often quietly, something else begins to surface: regret. This regret doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in during unguarded moments. It shows up when they revisit old messages and reread the warmth they used to overlook. It lingers when they hear a song, see a photo, or come across something that reminds them of the stability and affection they once had. They start to recall the emotional safety their partner offered, the patience, the effort, the consistency, and it dawns on them that what they pushed away wasn't pressure, it was care. Regret, for the avoidant, is especially complicated because it comes after a series of choices they made with certainty, choices rooted in self-protection. They were sure they needed distance. They believed walking away or staying guarded was the right move. So when the ache of missing someone sets in, it creates dissonance. They feel something they were never supposed to feel. They miss something they told themselves they didn't need. But pride is deeply embedded in the avoidant's emotional framework. Pride protects them from admitting vulnerability. It shields them from facing the shame of being wrong or from revealing emotional dependency. To reach out would mean admitting that they care, that they made a mistake, that the relationship mattered more than they let on. And to someone who's built their identity around being emotionally self-sufficient, that kind of confession feels threatening. So even when the regret is strong, pride becomes the barrier. They think about reaching out, but talk themselves out of it. They check their phone to see if the other person has texted first, hoping to be spared the risk of rejection. They craft messages in their mind, but never send them. They scroll through memories, but never say a word. The longing builds quietly beneath the surface, but on the outside, they remain still, calm, distant, and composed. This paralysis often leads to self-sabotage. Instead of making amends, they create justifications. It wouldn't have worked anyway. They probably moved on. I'm better off without the drama. These thoughts aren't coming from clarity. They're coming from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being seen as weak, fear of letting someone else have emotional power over them. Even if they feel the pull to reconnect, to apologize, or to explain themselves, they hesitate. The words don't come easily because expressing emotion has never been a well-developed skill for them. They were taught, implicitly or explicitly, that vulnerability equals exposure, and exposure equals danger. So they stay in silence, trapped between the desire to repair and the need to maintain pride. Meanwhile, the world moves on. Their former partner may be healing, growing, rebuilding their life. The window to reconnect gradually narrows, but the avoidant still waits, perhaps for the other person to make the first move, or perhaps for the feelings to fade. The regret never really leaves. It just becomes something they carry, quietly and privately. They think about what could have been different, how things might have turned out if they had just leaned in instead of pulling away. But the moment to act keeps slipping through their fingers, not because they don't care, but because caring openly still feels like too much to risk. In an anxious, avoidant dynamic, both partners often fall into unconscious roles that shape the relationship. The anxious partner becomes the pursuer, the one who reaches, initiates, questions, and holds the emotional weight of the relationship. The avoidant becomes the distancer, the one who retreats, withholds, deflects, and creates space to preserve autonomy. These roles aren't chosen maliciously. They're survival strategies shaped by past wounds, fears, and unmet needs. The anxious person often carries a deep-rooted fear of abandonment. They've learned to seek safety in closeness, in reassurance, in knowing where they stand. This often translates into overfunctioning in relationships, constantly trying to prove their worth, asking for validation, or adjusting themselves to be more lovable. Over time, they start to believe that if they can just be good enough, consistent enough, or emotionally available enough, they can earn the security they crave. On the other side, the avoidant often fears engulfment. Emotional demands feel like pressure. Vulnerability feels unsafe. They've learned that depending on others invites disappointment, so they cope by staying self-contained. When someone gets too close, they pull away, not because they don't care, but because closeness feels like a loss of control. To them, space feels safer than connection, even if it comes at the cost of emotional intimacy. When these roles become rigid, the relationship becomes less about authentic connection and more about survival. The anxious partner becomes more anxious, sensing the emotional distance. The avoidant, in turn, feels more smothered, reacting to the anxious partner's heightened pursuit. Each person's coping strategy activates the other's deepest fear. It becomes a feedback loop where both believe they are reacting, not initiating. The anxious thinks, "I wouldn't chase if you didn't run," and the avoidant thinks, "I wouldn't run if you didn't chase." But healing doesn't happen through winning the tug-of-war. It begins when both partners start to recognize the roles they're playing and the stories that keep those roles in place. When the anxious partner realizes that their value isn't determined by how much they give or how tightly they hold on, they begin to loosen their grip. They start to understand that love isn't earned through self-sacrifice, and that space isn't always abandonment. It can be a healthy boundary. The avoidant, too, begins to see that their need for space doesn't have to come at the cost of connection. They start to realize that intimacy doesn't mean losing themselves, that letting someone in doesn't guarantee pain, and most importantly, that emotional vulnerability is not a weakness but a bridge toward real closeness. When they allow themselves to feel, rather than suppress, they begin to understand their own needs more clearly, not just their fears. In this mutual awakening, the roles lose their grip. The anxious stops reaching to avoid rejection and starts reaching from a place of secure self-worth. The avoidant stops retreating out of fear and starts engaging from a place of self-awareness. The emotional landscape shifts from reaction to intention. Communication becomes clearer, not because one partner has changed completely, but because both are no longer stuck performing the same emotional script. Without the rigid roles, both partners begin to meet each other as they are, not as projections of past wounds. They can express needs without guilt, listen without defensiveness, and respond without fear. Instead of trying to fix, chase, avoid, or control, they begin to relate. The anxious discovers they are enough without overextending. The avoidant learns they are safe without shutting down. Both begin to see the other not as a threat to their emotional survival, but as a partner capable of growth, depth, and repair. As both partners step out of the roles that once defined them, they make space for something neither truly had before, not performance, not perfection, but the raw, honest connection that only becomes possible when both feel free to show up as themselves, when both partners stop playing the roles of pursuer and distancer. Real healing begins. It's no longer about reacting to fear, but about responding with intention. The anxious partner finds stability within themselves, and the avoidant learns to stay present without feeling trapped. In this shift, the relationship transforms from a cycle of emotional survival to a space of genuine connection. No one is chasing or running anymore. Both are simply meeting honestly as they are. That's where intimacy lives, not in roles, but in the courage to let go of them and build something real together, one conscious choice at a time.